like to actually continue a number of the themes that have been brought up here, and particularly in this session. We've heard one of the notions I want to introduce you to was term coined by a friend of mine in France who actually introduced me to the Adua affair, and that's Nidra Polar, and she talks about lethal narratives. And we've heard about narratives, and lethal narratives, as somebody, I think the ambassador mentioned, these are stories that are intended to create hatred. They're stories not just about people doing damage to other people, but people doing them deliberately. And so what I'd like to do is, what has, I think, shocked me in the last 12 years is the almost endless appetite amongst intellectuals, but I'll go further and just say sort of elites in the West, sort of really endless appetite for lethal narratives about Jews, or what I call stories about Jews behaving badly. And particularly, Israeli Jews behaving badly. We got, yeah, here it is. Okay, that's good.
We don't see it here.
Let's get rid of that, so I got some.
Oh, there it is. Okay.
Okay. Very good. Okay, so let me just start with this image. You probably, most of you are not high school kids who were 5 years old when this happened. This is September 30th, 2000, story of Muhammad Adura. Possibly, in terms of cognitive warfare, what I call the nuclear bomb of cognitive warfare. Now, all right, so what am I going to do here? I'll figure this out. All right.
Oh, no, you just moved it, though.
Oh, I see. All right. That's good. All right. So now, what happened to me was I came to the Adua affair as a medievalist. I saw it operating as a kind of modern or postmodern blood libel. I won't try and defend that. We can talk about it later, but I came to it as a blood libel. At the time, I didn't know what I'm pretty sure now is the case, that this was staged. It wasn't even a kid caught in a crossfire. It was actually staged. It's a lousy piece of work. Let me just show you one. All right, so this is my, I shouldn't say my favorite scene, but the footage that Talal Abu Ahmed took of this sequence contained 6 different takes. You saw take 3. And this is take 6. Anderlin, the journalist from France too, who is the one who propagated this story, thereby making him the first Jew in the history of blood libels the first identified Jew to circulate a blood libel against his own people, cut this scene from the sequence. You can see that the boy's elbow is up here. He's like this. Allegedly, he's dying from a stomach wound, but rather than clutch his stomach, he has his hands over his eyes and he picks up and looks out. Very deliberate motion. I'm not going to go into the details of what's going on. Let's say that the kid just got caught in a crossfire and shot. This was the reaction of the West. Oh, there we go. All right, so this is Place de la République on a week later, October 6th, 2000. There's a large demonstration, and just to give you an idea of what that banner looks like up close, you have Star of David equals swastika, and this is Muhammad Adura and the boy, and the banner here says, and they kill children too. The Muhammad Adura story it electrified both the Muslim world and the Western world. It deeply depressed and upset Israelis who by and large believed it. When I first started working on it, I met a journalist. I said, what do you think about the Adua affair? He said, 100% the Israelis killed him. This was after a fair amount of research had come out to show that couldn't have been the case. Catherine Ney, a journalist, a very prominent journalist in France. She's written a number of books on the political process. She's a major player. Made the following remark about the Adula picture. She said, this picture replaces the picture of the boy in the ghetto, in the Warsaw Ghetto, a famous picture that was symbolic of the Nazis killing 6 million people, 1 million of them children. Now, I consider this statement, which obviously tore at the guts of every Jew in France who heard it. What did I just do? All right. Why is this doing this to me? I consider this statement to be a form of moral insanity. Why? Okay, here we go. Moral folly. No morally sane person could ever think that the death of one child in a crossfire replaces an image that symbolizes the deliberate murder of 6 million civilians, 1 million of them children. Only some deep-seated need could lead to so absurd a moral accusation. Some explain it as a reaction against Holocaust guilt. Adula was a get-out-of-Holocaust guilt-free card. And there was surely some truth to that in the responses from the European continent. But this was a more ecumenical phenomenon with an appeal far beyond the lands directly involved in the Holocaust. The British, whose guilt for the extermination of Jews does not compare with, say, that of the French, were every bit as excited by the news of Adula and similar tales. The Jenin massacre, the desecrating siege of the Church of the Nativity in the same operation, which an Italian newspaper depicted as an infant Jesus saying, not about the terrorists in the church, but the Israeli tanks outside, surely they don't want to kill me again. As both speakers noted last night, there's a link between Christian anti-Semitism and Nazism here in the post-Holocaust world, re-emerging in the orgy of sadistic accusations against Israel, their Nazi intent not only freeing the Europeans from guilt, really, but freeing them to reassert those critical supersessionist narratives about their deliberate malicious murder of our God. This is not only raw supersessionism, feeding the worst instincts of self-aggrandizing self-pity, but it's also suicidal to be that far out of touch with reality when dealing with a real enemy of both Jews and the rest of the non-Muslim world, and by the way, I should add most of the Muslim world as well. But the appeal of this icon of hatred, this permission slip to abuse the Israelis with the most sadistic moral epithets, most poignantly as Nazis, went far beyond this, not only in the lens of the Holocaust and of traditional Christian anti-Semitism, it held a tremendous appeal for what one normally thinks of as the secular, post-Christian, progressive left, a place where one would least expect to find the kind of hate-mongering and demonization that in fact began to take place in the wake of the Adula story. And yet, if anything, the progressive left represents the group most energized by the Adula story. Here we have, this is from Ramsey Clark's website. No, hold on, here we go. That's good. Is it up there? There, no, all right. Here we go. Okay, so now I put the quote from Catherine Ney over it, but this was a very common icon of Adula as comparing with, and in some cases viewed as replacing, the picture of the boy in the ghetto. The open marriage of the post-colonial left and jihadi imperialists dates to these opening years of the 21st century, presided over at Durban. And one of the wedding guests at this unholy union is a sharing of the identification of Israel as the Antichrist. Here we go. This is from a rally in San Francisco in 2006. You were there? Yeah. This is zombie time. Right. So this is a theological statement coming from an allegedly secular left. Nor is this problem just of Adura. The last 12 years have been punctuated by a series of anti-Zionist lethal narratives, stories about Israel that attribute the most malevolent motives, that emphasize... Why is this happening to me? All right, so you've already heard about these narratives. I would like to make a website with this, but the point is that Adura really opened the gates to this kind of phenomenon. I've never had this much trouble. Oh, I think I know what's wrong with this. All right. Okay, so and for reasons that bear close attention, our own Western media takes these deliberately dishonest and malicious narratives and turns them into news, at once inciting Muslim hatred of Jews, even if they feed this strange appetite that Western audiences seem to have for these stories of wicked Jews behaving badly. The entire BDS movement rests on an edifice of lethal narratives, none of which could stand up to scrutiny. The worst Israeli behavior on and off the battlefield compares favorably with the worst of any other sovereignty in the history of the world, ancient, medieval, and modern, a fortiori in comparison with Nazis and jihadis. Again, one might say, oh, but it's just Jew baiting. It's a very old tradition of bullying that goes back centuries, if not millennia. But whereas in the past, Jew baiting, that is the gratuitous demeaning of Jews whom you know won't strike back, was relatively cost-free in the short run. Today, it's nothing short of suicidal. While French TV obsessively reran the footage of Adura almost as much as Al Jazeera, because it made them feel good, they were waving the flag of jihad in front of their own immigrant Muslim population. 2 years later, as the French and other Europeans celebrated suicide bombers in demonstrations of support for the Palestinians during the Israeli operation in Jenin, they had no idea that jihadis considered them targets as well. So far, the suicide terror had only struck Israel and the United States, and surely they deserved it. As Baudrillard, a famous French sociologist, remarked in the pages of Le Monde shortly 10 days after 9/11, they did it, we wanted it. Then in 2005, the suburbs erupted all over France, burning cars and trashing neighborhoods, while the police, terrified that a picture of them hurting or, God forbid, killing an immigrant Muslim child would set off a wave of suicide terror, were forced to stand by. As one French woman admitted to me in hushed tones, the Arabs act as if they have a knife to our throats, and we act as if they have a knife to our throats. So, this thirst for stories of Jews behaving badly is widespread both geographically and ideologically. It crosses the religious-secular divide, and it is dangerous to those who indulge these appetites. Very dangerous. It strengthens their foes, weakens their friends. What could explain such bizarrely self-destructive behavior? My answer is that this behavior consists of a kind of moral schadenfreude. That is to say, a moral schadenfreude which itself reflects supersessionist needs. Moral schadenfreude, I would argue, is a measure of replacement theology. First, let me reframe replacement theology not as a theological issue so much as a psychological one. It seems to me that it reflects a form of zero-sum thinking that is focused not on matters of guilt and integrity, but of shame and honor, of appearances. We are right because you are wrong. We are good because you are bad. We have honor because you are disgraced. I'm not breaking any new ground here when I observe that the vexing question of chosenness centers around the agonizing question common among siblings and the focus of the Bible's patriarchal narratives, who's daddy's favorite? For Christians and Muslims who come after the Jews, The problem is existential. For Jews who came up with the idea in the first place, it's less so. Those strains of both Christianity and Islam that have opted for conquest, dominion, sovereignty, have also opted for invidious identity formation. Here, driven by a psychological insecurity, some believers opt for the notion that you make yourself look bigger by making other people look smaller. Thus, our chosenness necessitates that you, the predecessors, for Christians, the Jews, for Muslims, the Jews, and the Christians, become unchosen. And our ability to lord it over you proves our superiority. One can see how such ways of handling insecurities feeds tendencies to bully when supersessionists gain power, hence the long tradition of Jew baiting. In the modern democratic world, where Jews are given full citizenship, one loses this ability to lord it over them. On the contrary, under fair conditions of equality before the law, Jews rise to positions of prominence. They fill the professions and even public office. And once they have their own state, they join not only the world of equal citizens, but equal nations. That's a lot for a supersessionist to handle. As we saw with the wave of ecumenical Jew hatred that burned through Europe, East and West during the Holocaust, modern conditions can exacerbate Jewish relationships with non-Jews. Free and independent Jews are frustrating, irritating, and potentially dangerous. Which brings us back to moral schadenfreude, or the pleasure one gets from viewing someone else's moral discomfiture. Somehow, it just comes trippingly off the tongue to turn to Israel and its Jewish supporters and say, you Jews, 2,000 years you were oppressed, and no sooner do you get power than you turn around and do it to somebody else. Never mind that Israel labors mightily and successfully, I would argue, to live up to standards towards enemies who want to destroy them that no nation, Christian or not, has been able to achieve in any age. Is it not enough? For some Jews, most decidedly yes. But that's a standard of perfectionism. Is that not enough? For some Jews, it's most decidedly not enough. But that's a standard of perfectionism that it seems to me no outsider has a right to demand from Jews. To paraphrase scripture, remove the beam from your eye before you obsess about the speck in mine. And yet, rather than engage in such introspection, the lust to despise, or as Augustine might have put it had he been a bit more self-critical, libido despiciendi, like that, is so great that one's joy in the moral degradation of the Jews drives one to moral sadism. You're as bad as the Nazis. In fact, you're worse than the Nazis because you should know better. Incidentally, we have Jews saying this. Gilad Atzmon, in the pages of Al Jazeera, does an extensive Talmudic logic about how the Jews are worse than the Nazis. To quote Martin Perry from earlier today, this is an addiction, one that needs a higher dose, Nazism, to get the same buzz. And like most addictions, it's self-destructive. Europeans, Christian and post-Christian Westerners, who eagerly go after the lethal narratives about Israel, are something like a fat person with a 350 cholesterol count who can't stop gobbling down those tasty truffles of schadenfreude. In other words, people with supersessionist insecurities get a huge kick out of being able to rejoice in the moral debasement of the Jewish state, whether there really is a moral case to be made or not. Supersessionism is an insecurity complex that needs to view things in zero-sum terms in order to reassure itself. And the appetite for tales of Jews behaving badly, the moral schadenfreude one sheps at the Jewish pain of being accused of terrible crimes and behaving like Nazis, is an indicator of that insecurity. Let's state it as a mathematical proposition. The attraction to lethal narratives about Jews is directly proportional to the insecurity of those believing these stories and their consequent need to assert a sense of moral superiority by looking down on Jews. And at the same time, that desire to believe the worst of Jews is inversely proportionate. Go away, stop. Is inversely proportionate to the actual moral behavior of the people so acting. What I'd like to suggest is that the supersessionist impulse will never disappear. like envy, like sibling rivalry. It's part of the DNA of the monotheist family. There will always be, even within small, highly spiritual communities, some Christians, Muslims, and Jews who feel insecure enough to need to put others down, to make themselves feel good by dumping on others. This is not a theological problem that can be solved by changing theology. It's a psychological one that cannot be fully solved. It can only be successfully resisted by encouraging a critical mass of faithful to achieve a kind of spiritual and psychological confidence that does not need to either convert, demean, or subject the other in order to feel good about oneself. The need to feel morally superior to Jews inheres in the need to replace them. So when we see Christians, even as they misbehave according to their own values, the very values that define their greatness, the unstinting love even of enemies, eagerly seeking evidence of Jews behaving badly, or on a larger scale, a Jewish nation behaving badly, then we can surmise that we are in the presence of a zero-sum need to seek one's moral stature, not in the integrity of acts themselves, but in the submission and denigration of the other. If this thesis is correct, then we should look at the great attraction of the progressive left for lethal narratives about Israel as an indicator of a supersessionist urge among secular believers. In this scenario, the progressive left has a secular form of replacement theology, first seen in certain zealous strands of the French Revolution, which demanded that Jews become citizens in place of being Jews, in which they replace the Jews as the moral cutting edge of humanity. Israel then represents a rival who must be put down in order to raise themselves up. In the conflict between Israel and her neighbors, where there's no question who holds the high moral ground, no matter what people passionately proclaim about their beliefs, only the most outsized underdogma, I don't know if you've heard this term, underdogma is the belief that the underdog is right no matter how wrong he might be, and no matter how badly he might behave, in which on the one side, the side you identify as the little guy there we go. The side you identify as the little guy that David gets to do anything to resist oppression, gets to do anything to resist oppression, preach genocidal hatred, concoct lethal libels, target civilians, sacrifice their own children on the altar of their lost honor. They get to do anything to resist. And on the other hand, you believe anything about the side you designate as the big guy, the Goliath. They're racists, they're slow-motion genociders, they deliberately kill their victims' children. How can one seriously argue that the Palestinians, unless you take this attitude, how can you seriously argue that the Palestinians hold the high moral ground? This analysis accords with what one might expect from those sufficiently insecure to need supersessionism. Envy and seek to demean your competition, condescend and stoop to help those so morally based they do not threaten your identity. Imagine, if you will, the progressive left, let's say a picture of Judith Butler, looking into the mirror and saying, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the most moral left-wing egalitarian movement of us all?" And lest the mirror answer Israel, which in almost 65 years of struggling with enemies who wish to destroy her, has not gone near the kind of totalitarianism that within mere years of taking power consumed every other left-wing egalitarian revolution so threatened. She covers up her ears and yells, "La, la, la, I can't hear you," and accuses Israel of right-wing colonialism, imperialism, racism, and genocide. It may soothe her troubled soul, but it hardly accords with anything remotely resembling a sane moral universe. Let me conclude on an optimistic, indeed genuinely comforting note. The error that the supersessionist left makes is to imagine that the ultimate enemy of peace and understanding is the very notion of us-them. Or as Edward Said put it in Orientalism, the notion of us and them, quote, always gets involved either in self-congratulation, my time is up, either in self-congratulation when one discusses one's own, or hostility and aggression when one discusses the other. I'm going to skip those. So I think the mistake that the left makes is to think that these boundaries and these separate identities is what creates war and suffering in history. Did I do that? Right. So, for instance, Judith Butler, gender, this idea that we can deconstruct these identities, we can deconstruct gender identities, and then everything will be fine if we just stop being different. What I'd like to suggest to you is the enemy is not us-them per se. In fact, I think us-them is a necessary part of being a human being, but zero-sum us-them thinking. Instead of needing to abolish the boundaries between various identities, gender, ethnicity, religion, and create a kind of entropic, homogenized global community, I think we should consider identities based on a sense of us and them as not only necessary to mental health, but a precious resource that should be encouraged rather than abolished. What we need is not a destruction of identity, here in this discussion, religious identity, but positive sum relations between different identities. Not the invidious formation of zero-sum identity, I'm better because you're worse, but the positive sum identity of, I hate to sound really corny here, I'm okay, you're okay. And here I recommend, if you haven't read it, I strongly recommend you read Rabbi Sachs's book, The Dignity of Difference. And the key there is that difference is a precious treasure that we have, and the important thing is that that difference shouldn't be negating other people, even as it asserts its own entity. In this sense, we can think we can understand, I'm almost done, two aspects of God's promise to Abraham. The first is, through you, all the nations, families of the world will be blessed. Now, if you think about it for a second, this notion of chosenness, you've been chosen, and what is the fulfillment of your chosen task? What's the way in which you fulfill your task as chosen? That other people will be blessed. You can't come up with a better formula for positive sum thinking. And then the second part, which is those who curse you, those who bless you will be blessed, those who curse you will be cursed, I think is, in some senses, an expression of what happens when people deal with Jews and deal with us in positive sum terms. I think the ambassador's remarks about our role in the UN are perfect expressions of this drive, this libido that Jews have towards positive sum behavior. You deal with us in positive sum ways, and we will deal with you in positive sum ways, and everybody will benefit. And if you curse us, of course we're going to be miserable, but you will make yourself miserable as well. So I'd like to conclude my remarks with what I think Rabbi Riskin would agree, a remark Rabbi Riskin might agree with. Jews may be the first chosen people, but that does not necessarily mean we are the only chosen people. It's not a question of denomination, it's a question of moral behavior between people and their neighbors. Thank you.